On this episode of Empowered Returns, I'm joined by President of Property Management at Charlesgate, Todd Mikelonis, and Managing Partner Mike DeMilla as we discuss the myth around 95% occupancy in multifamily lease-up. Let's dig in. Hello, hello. Welcome to Empowered Returns. Today we have an extra special guest with us. Todd is joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tori.
Absolutely. And Mike, you're still here?
As far as I am aware, I am still here.
I'm really excited about this conversation, especially because it's something that you and Todd have both had really successful examples in terms of thought leadership with this concept of 95% leased. Is 95% leased stabilized? Is 95% leased not a success signal anymore? What does that look like? And this pretty big myth in the industry that once you've hit a certain percentage, like the work is done.
And by the way, it's not just a pretty big myth. It's the biggest fucking myth in the industry that 95% stabilizes maximum occupancy. And if you go above that, it means your rents are too low. And if you go below that, your rents are too high. It's absolute total nonsense. And we're going to talk about that today. And I'm excited to dive in.
A lot of people have asked the question, whoever made the rule that 95% leased is the benchmark for stabilization. My question for you is, who did make that rule? Who decided that?
That is a question that I love to ask. It's actually, I will give credit to Danny Meyer, who wrote that question in his book, Setting the Table. Side note, one of the best business books I've ever read. But he wrote a chapter in the book that was about whoever wrote the rule. And the idea is that all these things that people do, all these traditions and quote unquote best practices that people follow, that are really just nobody knows where they came from. Nobody knows why they're supposedly best practices. Nobody knows how it evolved to be such a way. And that is exactly what this is. So the question I say is, whoever wrote this rule and why are we still following it?
And I couldn't agree more. Like, I understand, some maybe conservative underwriting, but that doesn't have to translate to an operational plan for every owner at every property when, you're talking about lender underwriting or maybe a conservative approach or estimate to, how a property might operate in terms of occupancy. Two very different things. And I think what happened is that became the rule for a lot of people, and it's just really they're just leaving money on the table.
You just mentioned a great point. Like people are leaving so much money on the table when they're just raising the flag that the property is all set when they hit 95%. We saw in the comments that Todd got in his post and the comments you've gotten on plenty of posts about this topic, the biggest challenge people face with that like 93 to 95% bubble of like occupancy. We struck a chord for sure. People were coming to us with all kinds of reasons that 93 to 95% is acceptable. So, firsthand, how have you overcome that challenge of getting outside of that occupancy bubble? What did you do to get to 100% and hold steady? And any, stories you can share, whatever, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few different approaches to this and like strategies to achieving it that others aren't employing. We talk about those strategies a lot, and I've been sharing more and more of them in terms of how we operate, in terms of our functional specialization, in terms of the roles, leasing, things like that. But like ultimately, 100% occupancy is like you're perfect. You have the building fully occupied, and that's what you should be striving to achieve. And really, at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. So what you're doing is you're pushing to that highest occupancy possible, and not just landing at 93 or 95% and then saying, "Well, that's good enough. We hit this. Let's go tackle the next thing or the next challenge at the property." It's about driving it as high as possible. And yeah, we have properties in the portfolio that are 100% occupied, and others that are 97, 98% occupied, which we're still dramatically exceeding any given market's expectations or market performance. What I'd also say is there's a lot of strategy that goes into that. So it's earlier lease renewal, showing occupied units, and then there's even layers to the property management experience and delivery that you have to add into that in terms of being able to execute on those things and get the responses. But at the end of the day, it's a numbers game, and it's about working with your team to use common sense strategies to get early notice, be able to show occupied units in advance, and pre-lease a lot of these units to lower that vacancy.
fundamentally there are four forces that drive occupancy, right? You've got market factors, so your macroeconomic factors, job creation, the supply environment, right? You've got demand experience, which is like, what are you doing for branding and marketing in your leasing process? And then you've got the structural vacancy, which means like, how long does it take you to turn a unit? How what's your notice period? Is like, are you pre-leasing or not for units that are vacant? And then fourth is resident experience and really the product. First, if you don't get the resident experience in the product right, it doesn't matter. You're never going to get to higher vacancy because your product sucks and it's just people aren't going to be willing to pay for it. So you've obviously got to get a great resident experience. You got to pay for your product right. All those other factors are mostly in your control, and I think a lot of owners and operators just chalk it up to the macro factors. Like, what's the supply environment like? Are there job creations? Is it a good market? Is it a slow market? Is there a lot of moves coming on? A lot of supply coming on? Is it so? They just fall into the trap of thinking that it's all about the market. But in fact, it's not. And I think, Todd, I'll let you speak to the specifics, but like this idea that you can actually make structural operational changes that reduce turn times, that pre-lease units, that give you more notice period to rent units. And then the question is, how do you take those markets that are turning and release them? How do you go to the market with it? Do you have a great brand? Do you have great demand generating marketing? Do you have a leasing team and leasing process that is going to actually get leasing results and not just put your newest entry level person as your leasing consultant that's in the job for 3 months? So all these things are really important. And there's so many things that owners can do to go beyond just saying, oh, it's the market. Oh, if you're at above 95% occupancy, the only way you get there is by having prices that are too low, which is, again, total bullshit. And we're not here to stand for that.
On the flip side of it, they're abandoning a lot of the little things that you can do to drive occupancy. And really, the counter argument is like boiling it down to using price optimization software and either lowering rents or increasing them and letting that drive occupancy rather than actually proactively manage properties. It is like mind numbing to me that, you know, the response and some of the comments on my recent post, I wanted to say, well, what is your answer? Is it just to just throw it into price optimization software and let that handle your leasing for you? And as soon as notices spike up, rents are going to go down, and that's how you're driving the rent prices. It's nuts to me.
That's exactly what happens when you fall into the market factors trap. It's like you're basically succumbing to the only tool in your toolbox being pricing. We'll lower the prices and cause more people to move in. We'll raise the prices and people will move out. It's like, okay, if you're only using that tool, you're losing a lot of opportunity and you're just giving away a lot of NOI that could otherwise be captured with, again, smarter operations, using a real professionalized leasing team, a centralized professionalized leasing team, for example, or like getting a larger, more in advance notice period, doing pre-leasing, all the things that that we have done and implemented. And Todd, you can speak to this in more detail than I can, though, but that really move the needle, that really drive NOI in a substantial way. And I suspect, there's always going to be some element of structural vacancy that just has to be happening. Because some units that are going to be down from time to time, some things that have to happen, of course. So like 100% is not real thing, but you can strive to get as close to that as possible while still obtaining market leading rents if you do all these other things right and not just rely on some silly revenue optimization that tells you if you lower the price, you're going to get more demand. Yeah, no shit.
Yeah, and I think you touched upon a few of them. I mean, a few of these, like, the secret sauce of it are early notice, having conversations starting as far out often as 150 days, 120 days out, having that conversation with residents. And of course, as I'll say it again and again, it's a numbers game. So you can list out the 4 or 5 things of why it doesn't work and whatever experience you had where somebody doesn't give you an answer or needs to wait till 30 days. But if you have 10 apartments that are coming up that are on notice and you're getting it out early and you get 7 of them to give you early notice, you have a jump on the market. It's a numbers game again. And it helps you chip away at them earlier. If you're going to be going to market, if you have earlier notice, it gives you a little bit more time to potentially actually increase rent, potentially above what they might have been able to get, what you might have been able to get if you only had 30 days notice or you're renting a vacant unrented because you waited for it to come empty or to become available. The second piece of it is having a professional sales team execute, having leasing salespeople that is their career execute the leasing and show the apartments. And quite frankly, if you're showing occupied units, they're going to be better salespeople at executing the sales process, understanding renters' needs, helping overcome objections, helping them evaluate what ultimately, even if they're not buying the property and they're renting, a huge important decision where they're going to be living for the next year or 2 years or a few years. And then the third piece of it is again showing those occupied units and setting that expectation from when they rent the apartment that this will happen when they move out, all the way to the experience that they're having through the rental process. And again, if we go down that checklist of why it doesn't work from the people who are the detractors, it's the place is a mess, the people won't let me in. Yes, there are going to be challenges, and I'll say it again, it's a numbers game. So there will be some circumstances where it might not be appropriate to show it in advance. And that's where Mike says 100%, it's something to work toward, but it's not something that's realistic to expect. So what you're doing is you're reducing, the potential for higher vacancy by doing all of these things leading up to it that lead to 97% occupied, 98% occupied. And then there's other little pieces to it too, like structuring leases to expire at, a time where it is a busier season and you have more renters in the market. Little things like that at properties, really, really drive big results in terms of reducing vacancy.
The other thing to kind of really dive into a little bit is this idea that the market is the market and the pricing is set by the market and all this other stuff. And yeah, at a gross level, that's true. Obviously, you're not going to get double the market, but that totally belies the fact that there's marketing exists in all industries for a reason, right? I mean, obviously, the point of doing marketing, the point of doing sales, which in this case is leasing, is that you're driving revenue. And with great marketing and great leasing, you can drive pricing higher because you're creating, capturing, accelerating more demand for your property versus the competitors in the market. And so the point of that is like, whatever, everyone understands we're looking at comps. And so we should charge, what the comps are, blah, 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 blah. But that speaks nothing of, or be close to the comps or slightly above, slightly below and all that stuff. But that speaks nothing to your differentiation as a product or as your different processes that you're operating. And I don't know. I mean, look, not all marketing and not all sales efforts is money well spent. I will certainly admit that. But it does, if done right and done well, it provides a multiple against investment that is a dramatic increase in what you can attain for occupancy and rents. And so that's a big miss in the market that people are just going and assuming that the market is what the market is. And one other point there is like, we're not saying like you're going to be this magic unicorn on a hill. So if for whatever reason you're in an oversupplied market for supply factors and the average vacancy or the average occupancy in a market is 88%, probably 98% is not a realistic goal in that market, but 95 might be in that market. And so that's the point. It's like you can make these changes, structural changes, operational changes, experience changes, and all the other things we talked about that can make you beat the market. If you just want to be the market, that's one thing. But if you're out there to actually make a better return than your competitors, if you're out there to deliver a better product than your competitors, the goal is to beat the market. So why not put the processes and the tools and the people and the teams in place that can actually beat the market?
That's a great point, Mike. All of these markets and submarkets are different, and what all these little, not little, but these techniques that we use are just giving us a competitive, or giving our clients really a competitive advantage against the other properties in the market. And we see it a lot. Just even the early notice. We've had properties where we get notice 120 days out, and our competitive properties in the area or other properties in the area don't have notice yet. So we're getting a jump on renters that are in the market, even if there is, an oversupply or we see an oversupply coming or a competitive market. We're able to take advantage of that. So there's a lot of execution pieces there that are really important. And then also the marketing material too. As you said, Mike, in terms of marketing and having good marketing in place, when you have a stabilized asset, if you have that marketing in place and you're able to deploy it in a way that generates interest and differentiates the property, it's a huge advantage layering on all of these pieces to the execution to be able to get eyes on the property before they come through the door.
100%, totally. And the other thing I do want to make sure we sort of reference and point out is like we're not just talking about occupancy for occupancy's sake. We're talking about what is going to maximize your NOI, right? And what are the goals of the property to maximize NOI? So yes, of course, it doesn't make sense to have 98% occupancy at far below market rents. That would make no sense. Your NOI is not going to be maximized that way. What we're talking about is maximizing occupancy and rents so that you're driving positive NOI, and those two things can be done together. And I think there's this myth I constantly see. The myth that we're talking about here is like, okay, some magic number, call it 95%, is that magic maximization. And if you go above that, your rents must be below market. And if you go below that, well, that means you can charge higher rents. But that doesn't speak to anything. What about what are your in-place rents already? What is your loss to lease? What is the market now? Where is the market appreciating? It makes no sense that people would just use that as a barometer. And why is it 95%? Why not 96%? Why not 93%? What is so magic about these numbers that people rely on as gospel at this point? It just makes no sense to say 95% occupancy is the magic number so that I know that your rents are too high or too low. It just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
I agree.
Absolutely. I think just listening to the both of you, it sounds like there is a lot of proactiveness going on with how you're approaching these lease ups and sellouts. And I think that is like the testament of a good operating partner and a good sales team is, you know, that reactive nature that we've seen so often in the industry where you're just pulling teeth trying to get people to show initiative and hustle and lease like their life depends on it. You know, I think back to my time as a leasing manager. I was the poorest I'll hopefully ever be. And when we would hit 95%, I, as the LM, viewed that as the time I call up the owner and say, hey, we got to lease the model. Like, that's a perfectly good 2 bedroom with a great view. Like, let's get the extra revenue. And I was so shocked and confused with all the comments that I was seeing where people weren't thinking that way. And maybe it's because I was dirt poor and needed the concession commission to live. But, you know, that is a common experience, I fear, with working with site teams that they just don't have that fire in them to show occupied units, and they don't have leaders like Todd and Mike telling them to like get after it and like get the leases done. Sometimes they're not even talking to corporate at all, and they're just newly entered leasing agents with barely any experience trying to be good at the job, and the job is really hard. I was just talking with a ex property manager yesterday, and they were like, the reason, like, look at what we pay like the property managers, because it's hard work to be on site. Like, it's not an easy job, it's not an entry level job.
In the multifamily industry, there are far too many spreadsheet junkies, whether it's a regional manager, an asset manager, developer owner. There are far too many people that are sitting with their pencil in a spreadsheet, and rather than relying on solid operators who are willing to challenge conventions, go the extra mile, and do the things it takes to really maximize NOI. And that's what we bring to the table. And that's what we've always tried to do, is challenge conventions and maximize return on investment, maximize NOI in any given year so that we're delivering results for our clients. And you can't do that by just relying on stale old best practices or stale old guidelines like 95% means full occupancy.
A big key piece of it are these specialized roles that we have.
Yeah.
And there is a real push, and we've been leading on that for a long time now, having people in the right seats in specialized roles and really excelling at them. And that's where you can dive in and drill in on these little things that move the market in terms of whether it's reducing vacancy and having specialized roles in terms of resident experience and triaging work orders and handling that side of the business. That's where you move it. And it's really in the details of the day to day. I mean, we've all been around property management, and whether it's occupancy we're talking about or we're talking about the expense side of it, it's in the details in terms of the management and paying close attention to operations and having, I would say the last piece of it is constantly measuring it proactively with scorecards, looking at the progress of the building on a weekly basis, or even more frequently in some cases with our team as we're looking at different things and making sure we're staying on track. On track, off track is what we talk about every day with all of our teams up and down the business. And that's what really makes the difference. And that's with, on the occupancy side, on the income side, as well as the property performance, whether it's expenses or even as on a high level NOI.
What are other hidden revenue gaps most developers don't even realize are being left on the table when they are leasing up a building?
In often cases it's created by the revenue management automated software, because what that doesn't take into account in many cases is the things like, what's that weird layout unit in one stack, what's the one that is should be have a good view but it's blocked by this weird billboard on the other side and it might be difficult to rent, and these other factors that really those specialized leasing team members and on the ground property managers recognize and know. And you need that input and you need that feedback from potential prospects that show you like this unit is worth more or less than another. So oftentimes there's this gap in potential revenue or lag in leasing particular units, whether it's particular stack, particular type, whichever direction it's facing, in more sun, less sun, all these other factors, tangible and intangible, that can dramatically impact it, that is outside of the demand in the market, or that is what you're doing for marketing. But if you think about those things, you build a program around it, you actually train and teach a professional leasing team how to overcome those objections and how to lease into those units when they're coming, there's a way you can dramatically increase and sort of decrease the potential for revenue gaps, based on some of these factors that can come into play from time to time. So that's one thing that's really, I don't think, recognized or talked about a lot, especially if the team doesn't really understand how to sell, right, and how to get feedback from prospects past that and connect it to marketing in a way that is attracting the right kinds of residents. All these factors are so important to maximizing revenue.
Yeah, or if there needs to be a price adjustment for that unit that's looking into that graffiti wall or whatever that factor is that may not be captured in the revenue management software. Or we could just follow, the other approach to this, which is just let the revenue management software do its job and let it sit vacant for 6 months, because that's going to really, really help the bottom line. That's the alternative, and that's where you have this vacancy in some properties where a unit just sits empty for, you know, 6 to 9 months, because there are factors that need to be considered that people are just following what the spreadsheet says.
You brought up a good point, Todd, about like the cost of turnover in site teams. I didn't even realize like that is looking back in my experience. I don't know if I've ever done a full lease up where like one person didn't like give notice. And the cost of like backfilling that role, losing the manpower to respond to leads, to send emails, to take tours, like that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother set of methodology that I know we love to talk about, but I just appreciate you bringing that up. So, my last question for the both of you is, I'm a developer right now. It's February 26th. It's about to be March. What is the one thing that you would do right now for me, the developer, to maximize the value, future proof the project so that I'm not settling for anything less than maximized occupancy come April, May?
I tend to look at the big picture. So the big picture in this is it's literally making sure you have your plan ready for which units are turning. Make sure you're communicating early and often to the tenants, understanding which ones might be turning, which ones are at risk to turning. Make sure you got your renewals planned outright, communicated in advance, and what the plan is, and then depending on what you're expecting for this busy seasonality turnover, get prepared, line up your marketing, think about what you need to do, what does your messaging need to be tweaked, does your positioning need to be tweaked a little bit, is your team ready to go for busy season? These factors are like really important. It's like you're coming into Super Bowl season, so to speak, in the leasing world, and so getting the team trained, prepared, enabled with the right updated collateral, positioning, messaging, knowing which units are turning, knowing some of the things we talked about earlier, like how to overcome defects in some floor plans, how to upsell the premium units, and how to really drive that demand, create an appearance or create a feel of scarcity amongst the units, so you know how to sell them better and get the right people in the building faster, with more demand and more and higher conversion rates from lead to lease. And so it's really, to me, just comes down to fundamentally getting that communication, knowing which units are turned, and then plan for how you're taking those units to market from a marketing and leasing standpoint.
And just get an early jump. If you get an early jump on them, it gives you more time to execute on everything that Mike just said. So you summed it up well, Mike.
There's a 60-day notice like period in the industry, we get that, but there's not a rule about how soon you start talking to residents and figuring out what their future looks like and their game plan when they're approaching the middle and final quarter of their lease. So
He wrote the rule on 60 days.
Yeah.
Next discussion is way too short notice periods because you're not delivering a great resident experience. You're not communicating with the residents enough. And so everyone's caught with, holding the bag because they're not getting as much notice as they could from their residents.
And listen, the different markets in different states might have different laws and rules, but like you need to know your market and what you can and can't do in terms of having a discussion. And in no way are we talking about diminishing our resident experience or not valuing our residents. I mean, we're in a market where there's a lot of education and a lot of professionals who are maybe early in their careers or move around and will be in a grad program and know in January, February that they're going to move in June, July, August, and are fine giving notice then because their plans are going to change because they always were. So it's again, it's about the numbers, it's about communication and their experience and getting that early notice, getting that early jump gives you the opportunity to pre-lease. And then, Mike, that key thing that you said was, have that scarcity. So again, as we go back to the numbers, as we get into April and May, and we're talking about June availability, if you have a 75 unit building, instead of having 7 or 8 units, if you have, one or two left to lease, coming up to, vacant unrented with, I'm sorry, notice unrented within 30 days, you're in a much better position than having all 10 units or something like that. And that's what we're talking about here.
Makes a lot of sense.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. This was a very great discussion. I'm sure the thread of comments on Todd and Mike's posts will be happy to hear from us again. We will have to link it in the comments. So I appreciate your time and I'm excited to get this out in the wild. Thank you.
Cool.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Tori. Good to talk to you, Todd.
Bye.